There is a particular kind of silence that history leaves behind when it has been deliberately made silent. Not the silence of something that simply faded, not the quiet erosion of time working against stone and memory alike, but the pointed, intentional silence of a civilization that was looked in the eye by another civilization and told that it would not be remembered, that its gods were wrong, that its priests were criminals, that its way of understanding the world was superstition, and its art was primitive, and its social order was barbarism dressed up in metal and mud. That silence is the loudest thing in all of British history, and it echoes across more than 2,000 years in ways that most people have never been taught to hear. We think we know the beginning of Britain. We imagine it starts with roads, straight and purposeful, cutting through dense forest and marshland like a declaration of intent. We picture legions moving in disciplined columns, the clank of Lorica segmentata, the eagle standard catching the grey Atlantic light. We picture a civilization arriving in a land that did not yet fully exist, imposing order on chaos, building something out of nothing. That is the story most of us absorbed somewhere between childhood and adulthood, and it is a story the Romans themselves worked very hard to ensure would be told. It is a story that suited them enormously, because if the land was empty, if the people already there were merely shadowed figures crouching in the undergrowth, then what was done to them required no accounting. But the land was not empty, not even close. Before the Roman legions crossed the narrow sea in 43 CE under the Emperor Claudius, Britain was home to a sophisticated, ancient, layered civilization that had been developing and deepening for thousands of years. A civilization with its own theology and philosophy, its own astronomy and medicine, its own law codes and trade routes, its own monumental architecture and refined metalwork, its own poetry and oral literature, so vast and intricate that it took a trained practitioner 20 years to memorize and master. A civilization of people who knew their landscape, with an intimacy that no invader could replicate, who had mapped the stars, who had organized their societies around principles of honor and kinship and sacred obligation, who had built settlements that archaeological evidence now tells us were among the most complex urban centers in Northern Europe at the time. That civilization is the subject of this story, and the story of how it was almost entirely erased, how the erasure was so comprehensive and so strategic that for centuries we simply accepted the absence of its record as evidence of its absence, is one of the most important and least understood stories in the long human history of these islands. To understand what was lost, we first have to understand how far back the roots of pre-Roman Britain actually go. Because the civilization the Romans encountered in the 1st century CE was not something that had appeared recently. It was the summit of a cultural and spiritual tradition that stretched back not hundreds, but thousands of years, layer upon layer of accumulated knowledge and practice and belief, each generation building on what came before, adapting and elaborating and refining a way of life that was tuned with extraordinary precision to the specific ecology and climate of the British Isles. The oldest chapter of this story begins not in the Iron Age of the Celts, but in the Neolithic, the New Stone Age, when the first farming communities arrived in Britain around 6,000 years ago. These were people who crossed from the European mainland, bringing with them not just seeds and livestock, but an entirely new relationship with the land. They cleared forests with polished stone axes. They built long barrows from earth and timber to house their dead, placing the bones of ancestors in carefully arranged chambers where they could be visited, consulted, incorporated into the spiritual life of the living. Death and memory were not separate from everyday existence for these people. They were woven into it. The dead did not go away. They remained present, accessible, part of the community in a form that had simply changed its nature. The Long Barrows of Britain are among the oldest surviving human constructions on Earth. Wayland's Smithy in Oxfordshire, West Kennet in Wiltshire, Bellas Knapp in Gloucestershire. These are structures built with an understanding of landscape, of solar alignment, of the relationship between the living and the dead that is still not fully understood by the archaeologists who study them. The chambers are oriented to catch the light at specific times of year. The bones inside were arranged and rearranged over generations, suggesting ritual practice that continued long after the original burials. These were not simply graves. They were places of ongoing relationship, of conversation across the boundary between life and death, built to last not for a single lifetime, but for eternity. And then came Stonehenge. It is worth pausing on Stonehenge for longer than the usual tourist summary allows, because what this monument represents in the context of the civilization that built it is genuinely staggering. The construction began around 5,000 years ago and continued in phases over more than 1,500 years, meaning that the people who completed the final form of the monument were separated from the people who began it by as much time as separates us today from the fall of the Western Roman Empire. Think about that for a moment. 1,500 years of continuous intention. 1,500 years of each new generation inheriting a project and a purpose and deciding to continue it, to add to it, to refine it. That is not the behavior of a people living hand to mouth in desperate ignorance. That is the behavior of a people with a sophisticated, durable, self-renewing, cultural and spiritual tradition capable of transmitting purpose across vast stretches of time. The engineering of Stonehenge alone is extraordinary. The blue stones in the inner circle, each weighing several tons, were transported from the Preseli Hills in Wales, a distance of roughly 250 miles. The sarcens of the outer ring, some weighing up to 25 tons, were moved from Marlborough Downs more than 20 miles away. The precision of their placement, the accuracy of the solar alignments, the careful geometry of the whole, none of this happened accidentally. None of this happened without planning, without knowledge, without sustained collective effort, organized and directed by people who understood what they were doing and why. We do not know exactly what Stonehenge was for. We have theories. We know it functioned as an astronomical observatory, tracking the movements of the sun and moon with a precision that enabled those who understood it to predict eclipses and solstices and the turning points of the agricultural year. We know it was associated with the dead because the surrounding landscape is dense with burial mounds. We know it was a place of pilgrimage because isotope analysis of human remains found nearby suggests people travelled to Stonehenge from across Britain and even from continental Europe. We know it was rebuilt and modified multiple times, each phase suggesting a shift in how the monument was understood and used. What we do not know, and may never know, is the full theological and philosophical system that made Stonehenge not just a structure, but a sacred centre, a meeting point between the human world and something larger than the human world, a place where the boundaries between the visible and invisible thinned and became permeable. That knowledge was held in human minds, transmitted through human voices, and when those voices were silenced, the knowledge they carried went with them. The Neolithic gave way to the Bronze Age around 4,500 years ago, and the Bronze Age brought in new people, new technologies, new cultural patterns. The Belbeca people arrived from continental Europe, bringing with them a distinctive pottery style, a new metallurgical tradition, and genetic signatures that ancient DNA analysis now shows spread through Britain remarkably rapidly, replacing much of the earlier Neolithic population within a few centuries. This was not necessarily a violent replacement. The mechanisms are still debated, but it was a profound demographic and cultural transformation. The descendants of the Long Barrow builders and the Stonehenge constructors were largely replaced by a new population, and yet what is striking is how much continuity remained. The new people continued to use and modify the old monuments. They continued to bury their dead in ways that showed reverence for the landscape and its sacred geography. They continued to orient their ritual practice around the movements of the sun and stars. Whatever happened to the individuals, something of the cultural and spiritual framework survived. Bronze Age Britain was a place of considerable sophistication. The metallurgical traditions that developed here produced objects of striking beauty and technical refinement. Axes and swords and cauldrons and jewellery worked in bronze with decorative patterns of extraordinary complexity. Trade networks connected Bronze Age Britain to continental Europe, to Ireland, to Scandinavia, exchanging not just goods but ideas, techniques, artistic traditions. The great circular henges and stone circles that dot the British landscape, many of them built or elaborated during this period, suggest a religious and ceremonial life of great richness. Settlement patterns show communities organized around agricultural fields, with enclosed farmsteads, communal storage, evidence of social hierarchy, and differentiated labor. And then, around 3,000 years ago, the world began to change. The Late Bronze Age collapse is a phenomenon that is better understood in the Mediterranean. The sudden, catastrophic failure of the interconnected palace economies of the Eastern Mediterranean around 1200 BCE, but its reverberations were felt across the whole of the connected world, including Britain. Climate deterioration, the disruption of trade networks, demographic upheaval. The evidence in the British archaeological record suggests significant stress and transformation during this period. Settlements were abandoned. Hordes of bronze objects were deposited in rivers and bogs and marshes in numbers that suggest ritual deposition, perhaps desperate offerings to powers that controlled the natural world, perhaps simply the caching of wealth by people living in uncertain times. The transition from Bronze Age to Iron Age in Britain was not a sudden switch, but a slow, complex transformation that played out over centuries. Iron technology arrived in Britain from continental Europe around 800 BCE, and its arrival changed everything. Iron ore was far more abundant than the tin and copper needed for bronze, which meant that iron tools and weapons could be produced in much larger quantities and at lower cost. Agricultural productivity increased dramatically as iron-tipped ploughs broke ground that had been impossible to cultivate before. Population grew, settlements expanded. The landscape was transformed by clearance and cultivation on a scale that had not previously been possible. And with this expansion came new social complexity, new political organization, new cultural forms. This is the world that became Celtic Britain, though the word Celtic requires some careful handling here. For much of the 20th century, the standard account of British prehistory included a Celtic invasion, a wave of Celtic-speaking people arriving from continental Europe and displacing or absorbing the earlier Bronze Age population. Modern archaeological and genetic research has substantially revised this picture. There does not appear to have been a mass migration of Celtic-speaking people into Britain during the Iron Age. The genetic record suggests considerable continuity from the Bronze Age population. What arrived was not primarily a people, but a language, a suite of artistic and cultural practices, a connected set of traditions that spread through the existing population via trade, elite exchange, intermarriage, and cultural prestige, rather than through conquest and replacement. The people we call the Celts were never a single unified ethnic group with a common identity and a shared homeland. Celtic languages, the family that includes Welsh, Irish, Scottish Gaelic, Cornish, Breton, and the now extinct languages of Gaul and Celtiberia, spread across a vast swath of Europe during the late Bronze Age and Iron Age, but the people who spoke them were diverse, divided into hundreds of distinct tribes and kingdoms with their own histories, customs, and traditions. What they shared was a broadly common cultural vocabulary, similar artistic styles, similar religious practices, similar social structures, similar values expressed through similar kinds of stories and laws. Celtic culture was less like a nation and more like a civilization in the classical sense, a broad framework within which many different peoples organized their lives. In Britain, this Celtic civilization reached its fullest and most complex expression in the centuries immediately before the Roman conquest. The island was divided among dozens of tribal kingdoms, each with its own ruling elite, its own patron deities, its own territorial boundaries and internal hierarchies. In the southeast, the Catuvellauni controlled the fertile lands of what is now Hertfordshire and Cambridgeshire, expanding aggressively in the decades before the invasion to become the dominant political power in southern Britain. Their king, Cunobelinus, immortalized centuries later in Shakespeare's Cymbeline, ruled from the great oppidum at Camulodunum, the place that would become Colchester, one of the largest and most sophisticated settlements in pre-Roman Britain. To the south, the Atrebates maintained close trading links with Gaul. To the east, the Trinovantes had their own capital at what is now Colchester, before the Catuvellauni expansion displaced them. In East Anglia, the Iceni grazed their horses on the wide heathlands and accumulated wealth in the form of elaborate gold and silver torques. In the west, the Dobuni and the Durotriges built massive hill forts on the chalk downs. In the north, the Brigantes were the largest tribal confederation on the island, covering much of what is now Yorkshire and the north of England. In Wales, the Silures and the Ordovices would prove the most tenacious resistors of Roman conquest. And in the far west and north, in Cornwall and Scotland and Ireland, variations of this Celtic cultural tradition continued in forms that the Romans never fully reached. The hill forts that the Iron Age Britons built across the landscape are among the most visible surviving evidence of their civilization, and they are more impressive than the term fort might suggest. Maiden Castle in Dorset is the most dramatic, a multi-phase hill fort of enormous size with elaborately designed entrance systems, multiple ramparts, and interior space sufficient to accommodate a substantial permanent population. When Arthur Evans first excavated it in the 1930s, the scale of what he uncovered forced a significant revision of assumptions about the complexity of pre-Roman British society. This was not a rough fortification thrown up by frightened villagers. It was a carefully engineered defensive and residential complex that had been planned, built, and maintained over several centuries by people with advanced knowledge of earthwork construction and an acute understanding of defensive architecture. Maiden Castle could house thousands of people. It had internal roads, defined residential zones, craft production areas, grain storage facilities. It was, in the most meaningful sense of the word, a town. And it was not unique. There were hundreds of hill forts across Britain, ranging from small enclosures to vast complexes comparable in scale and complexity to Maiden Castle. Some were primarily defensive refuges, used only in times of crisis. Others were permanent centres of population, administration, craft production, and trade. Taken together, they represent a level of urban organisation and social complexity that challenges the Roman narrative of arriving in a land of scattered, disorganized barbarians. The oppida of the late Iron Age pushed this picture of complexity even further. In the century or so before the Roman conquest, particularly in the southeast of England, a new form of settlement emerged that was qualitatively different from the earlier hill forts. The oppida were large, low-lying enclosures covering in some cases hundreds of hectares. defined not by massive earthwork ramparts on hilltops, but by more extensive, but less dramatic boundary systems in valleys and river confluences, positioned to take advantage of trade routes and navigable waterways rather than purely defensive terrain. Cunobelinus's capital at Camulodunum covered an area of some 30 square kilometres. Verulamium, near modern St Albans, was another major oppidum. These were places of intense economic activity, with evidence of metalworking, pottery production, coin minting, textile manufacture, and long-distance trade. They had markets and administrative functions. They had social hierarchies of considerable complexity. They were, in the terminology that archaeologists have increasingly come to use, proto-urban centres, and they minted coins. The development of a coinage in late Iron Age Britain is one of the most significant and least appreciated facts about the sophistication of pre-Roman British civilization. British Iron Age coins are not crude imitations of foreign money. They are, at their finest, objects of genuine artistic achievement, displaying complex imagery. Horses in stylized flight, abstract Celtic knotwork, solar symbols, human faces, weapons, chariots, in compositions that demonstrate a highly developed visual aesthetic and a capacity for symbolic thought expressed in miniature. The coins also carried names, the names of kings and peoples, rendered first in indigenous script, and then, as cultural contact with the Roman world intensified in the late 1st century, BCE, and the early 1st century, CE, in Latin letters. This is not the behavior of illiterate savages. This is the behavior of people who had a concept of political authority and its representation, who understood the economic and symbolic functions of standardized currency, who were in active cultural dialogue with the most sophisticated civilization in the Western world. That active cultural dialogue extended to trade on a considerable scale. Long before Julius Caesar landed on the British coast in 55 BCE, Britain was deeply integrated into the continental trade network. British tin, which had been flowing to the Mediterranean via Gaul since at least the Bronze Age, remained a crucial commodity. British gold, cattle, hunting dogs, grain, and slaves were exported south in exchange for wine, olive oil, fine ceramics, glass, and other luxury goods. The volume of Roman amphorae found at late Iron Age British sites is remarkable. These were communities that were drinking imported wine in quantities that suggest elite consumption had become a significant feature of social and political life. The tribal aristocracy of southeastern Britain was in certain respects already significantly Romanized before the Roman army ever crossed the Channel. This is a crucial point for understanding the nature of the Roman conquest and what it actually destroyed. The southeastern British elites were not ignorant of the Roman world. They were trading with it, learning its languages, adopting elements of its material culture, sending their children to be educated in Gaul. Some of them, like Verica of the Atrebates, were formally recognized as client kings by the Roman emperor. The conquest was not an encounter between civilization and barbarism. It was a complex political and military event in which sophisticated actors on both sides made calculations about power, alliance, resistance, and survival. What the Romans could not tolerate, what they specifically identified as the aspect of British society most in need of elimination, was not the material culture or the political organization of the tribes. It was the Druids. The Druidic tradition is the heart of pre-Roman British civilization, and it is the aspect of that civilization about which our ignorance is most complete and most deliberate. The Druids were not simply priests in the narrow sense that word carries today. They were the entire intellectual and spiritual infrastructure of Celtic society. They were theologians and philosophers, yes, but also judges and lawyers, astronomers and physicians, historians and genealogists, poets and musicians, diplomats and arbiters of disputes between tribes and kingdoms. In a society without writing, or more precisely, in a society that made a principled choice not to commit its most important knowledge to written form, the Druids were the living library. Everything that mattered was held in their memories and transmitted through their voices. The choice not to write was not a failure of technology. The Celts were perfectly aware of writing and used it for certain purposes. Inscriptions, coin legends, accounting marks. The decision to maintain the core of their knowledge in oral rather than written form was a philosophical choice, one that the ancient sources note explicitly. Julius Caesar, who knew the Gauls and their Druids as well as any Roman, observed in his Gallic Wars that the Druids refused to commit their doctrine to writing because they believed that writing weakened memory, and also that written doctrine was less secure. It could be read by the uninitiated, and its meaning could be distorted. The spoken word, transmitted from teacher to student in conditions of trust and relationship, was more reliable. It preserved not just the content of knowledge, but the context, the tone, the living interpretation. This was not an irrational position. Modern cognitive science has confirmed in considerable detail what the ancient oral traditions intuited: that memory supported by meaningful structure, by rhythm and melody, and narrative and emotional context, is extraordinarily robust and accurate. The great oral traditions of the world, the Vedas, the Homeric epics, the bardic traditions of Celtic and Germanic cultures, were capable of transmitting vast bodies of complex material with remarkable fidelity across many generations. The Druids trained for 20 years of intensive memorization and interpretation and practice, under the guidance of experienced teachers in communities dedicated to the preservation and transmission of knowledge. What they carried in their minds at the end of that training was almost certainly staggering in its depth and breadth. We know frustratingly little about the content of Druidic teaching, for the simple reason that it was never written down, and those who held it were either killed or silenced in the decades following the Roman conquest. What we have are scattered observations from classical authors: Caesar, Strabo, Diodorus, Siculus, Pliny, the Elder, Tacitus, most of whom are writing from outside the tradition, often with an agenda, and some of whom are clearly working from earlier sources rather than personal observation. We have the mythological and literary materials that survived in Ireland and Wales, written down in the medieval period, but preserving traditions that almost certainly predate Christianity, and in some cases stretch back to the pre-Roman Iron Age. And we have the archaeology, which cannot tell us what people believed, but can tell us something about what they did. And from what they did, we can sometimes infer what they believed. From these scattered sources, a picture emerges. The Druids believed in the immortality of the soul and its transmigration between bodies, not as a peripheral or optional doctrine, but as the central theological fact from which everything else followed. Caesar thought this belief explained the famous courage of the Celtic warrior, who fought without fear of death, because death was simply a change of state rather than an ending. The soul would return. The relationship between the living and the dead, and between the human and the divine, was ongoing and reciprocal. Sacred landscapes, groves, springs, lakes, hilltops, were places where the boundaries between worlds were thinner, where communication between the human and the divine was more immediate. The natural world was not dead matter to be exploited, but a living system infused with sacred presence, animated by forces that demanded respect and reciprocal relationship. The Druids maintained sacred groves called nemeton in the Celtic languages, a word that survives in British place names to this day, most famously in Nemetona, the grove goddess, and in place names like Nymphsfield and Buxton, which derives from a Romano-British form of the same root. These groves were temples without walls, sacred spaces defined by living trees rather than stone or timber construction, where the prayers and sacrifices and ceremonies of the community were conducted under the open sky. Roman authors describe them with a mixture of fascination and horror, noting the ancient trees, the altars, the offerings, and sometimes, though the extent of this practice is debated, human sacrifice. The horror in the Roman descriptions is partly genuine revulsion and partly political propaganda, designed to justify the suppression of Druidism as the elimination of a barbaric and criminal cult rather than the destruction of a sophisticated religious tradition. That the Romans feared the Druids politically, as well as finding them theologically objectionable, is clear from the historical record. The Druids were the connective tissue of Celtic society across tribal and national boundaries. Their training was conducted in common settings. Caesar mentions Britain as the heartland of Druidic training, the place where Gallic Druids went to deepen their education. Their legal and arbitration functions gave them authority that transcended the power of individual tribal kings. A ruling that banned Druids from practicing in Gaul, issued first by Augustus and confirmed by Claudius, preceded the invasion of Britain. This was not simply religious intolerance. It was strategic. The Romans knew that as long as the Druids existed, a network of communication, organization, and ideological resistance existed that could animate revolt across the whole of the Celtic world. The Boudiccan Revolt of 60 or 61 CE, the most serious military crisis Rome faced in Britain, demonstrated exactly this. Boudica, whose name means victory in the Brythonic Celtic language, a cognate of the Irish Buadash, and ultimately of the name Boudica that appears in Latin sources, was queen of the Iceni, a tribe in what is now Norfolk and Suffolk. Her husband Prasutagus had ruled as a client king of Rome, and on his death he had left his kingdom jointly to his two daughters and to the Roman emperor, presumably hoping this arrangement would protect his family and people. The Romans ignored the will. They annexed the Iceni kingdom directly, flogged Boudica, and assaulted her daughters. This was not simply poor diplomacy. It was a calculated insult that transformed a manageable succession question into a civilizational confrontation. Boudica rallied not only the Iceni, but the neighboring Trinovantes and other tribes, channeling a decade of accumulated grievances about Roman taxation, land confiscation, debt enforcement, and the casual brutality of Roman administration. Her forces, ancient sources, put them at numbers that are almost certainly exaggerated, but were certainly vast. Destroyed three of the most important Roman settlements in Britain: Camulodunum, the first Roman capital, Londinium, already the main commercial centre, and Verulamium, the Roman city built near the old Catuvellauni Oppidum. The destruction was total and savage. Archaeological excavation beneath the streets of modern London has found the burnt layer from Boudica's assault. A vivid red-orange stratum of ash and fire-scorched debris lying beneath 2,000 years of subsequent occupation, a mark on the earth that has never been erased. The Roman governor, Gaius Suetonius Paulinus, was far away in Wales at the time, conducting what Tacitus describes as one of the most dramatic and consequential military operations of the whole conquest: the assault on the island of Mona, which the Romans knew as Mona Insula, and which is today called Anglesey. Anglesey was the last great stronghold of the Druids in southern Britain. It was there, on that island off the northwestern tip of Wales, that the last concentration of Druidic priests and priestesses had gathered, and it was there that Suetonius Paulinus chose to strike at the spiritual heart of British resistance. The account that Tacitus gives of the assault on Anglesey in his Annals is one of the most vivid and unsettling passages in all of classical literature. On the shore, facing the Roman troops across the strait, stood the Druids with their arms raised, calling down curses in voices that Tacitus describes as making even the battle-hardened legionaries hesitate. Among them were women dressed in black, with dishevelled hair, carrying torches, moving like furies. Tacitus, writing from a Roman perspective, cannot quite suppress the strangeness of what he is describing, the sense of a profound confrontation between two entirely different ways of being in the world. Suetonius ordered his men forward. The Roman soldiers crossed the strait, some by boat, some by swimming their horses through the shallows, and drove the defenders back. The Druids and their supporters were slaughtered. The sacred groves of Anglesey were cut down. The ancient trees that had been the living temples of a tradition stretching back, in one form or another, for thousands of years were felled and burned. It was at this moment, with the last Druidic stronghold in flames, that Suetonius received the news of Boudicca's revolt and turned his army south. The groves of Anglesey were gone. Most of those who had tended them were dead, and the great network of oral tradition, theological knowledge, historical memory, legal precedent, astronomical calculation, medical knowledge, and philosophical teaching that the Druids had maintained for generations, all of it carried in human minds and transmitted through human voices, went with them into the silence. We should be clear about what this silence means. It does not mean that Celtic culture or Celtic identity was immediately extinguished. Britain remained, for the 4 centuries of Roman occupation, a place where the indigenous population lived, worked, worshipped in their own ways, spoke their own languages, maintained their own social customs and family structures. The Romanization of Britain was real but also partial and uneven. In the cities and towns, in the villa estates of the southeast, in the spaces of official and commercial life, Latin culture predominated. But beyond those centres, in the farms and villages, in the uplands and the western and northern margins of the island, something of the pre-Roman world persisted. The Brythonic Celtic language continued to be spoken across most of the island throughout the Roman period and for centuries beyond it. The gods of the Celtic tradition were not abandoned, but were in many cases assimilated to Roman divine equivalents in the syncretistic fashion that the Roman religious system facilitated. Sulis at Bath became Sulis Minerva. Nodons at Lydney became Nodons Mars. The theological system underlying the worship of these deities, the entire complex of cosmological belief and ritual practice that the Druids had maintained, that was gone, or at least pushed underground, surviving only in fragments and transformations. The material culture of pre-Roman Britain is, by contrast, extraordinarily rich. One of the most important aspects of the story that has been systematically underappreciated is the quality and sophistication of Iron Age British art. Latin art, the style associated with Celtic cultures across Europe from around 450 BCE onwards, is one of the great artistic traditions of the ancient world, and its British manifestation in the late Iron Age produced objects of exceptional beauty and technical mastery. The Battersea Shield, now in the British Museum, is perhaps the single most beautiful object to survive from pre-Roman Britain. Found in the Thames at Battersea in the mid-19th century, it is a bronze shield facing or parade shield of the 1st century BCE, decorated with swirling, interlocking patterns of extraordinary refinement, the surface alive with the characteristic Celtic interplay of organic and geometric forms, of tension and release, of suggestion and concealment. It was never a functional weapon. It was a ritual object, perhaps a votive offering to the river, made with a level of skill and artistic intention that places it alongside the finest metalwork of any culture in the ancient world. The Waterloo helmet, also from the Thames, is equally astonishing. A bronze ceremonial helmet with horns, decorated in Latin style, unique in the European archaeological record. The Snettisham torque, found in Norfolk and made from electrum, a natural alloy of gold and silver, is a neck ring of twisted strands of alloy wire worked into a complex, rope-like structure with elaborately decorated terminals. One of hundreds of Iron Age talks found in Britain and Ireland that demonstrate the extraordinary technical sophistication of Celtic goldsmithing. The Desborough mirror from Northamptonshire is a bronze hand mirror with a back surface decorated in a design of such intricate and precisely balanced complexity that its geometry was only fully understood when it was analyzed using modern mathematical tools. These objects were not made by barbarians. They were made by artists working in a tradition that valued aesthetic experience and symbolic meaning at least as highly as any tradition in the classical world. The difference was not in the quality of the art, but in the nature of what the art expressed. Greek and Roman art was predominantly figurative, concerned with the representation of the human body in space, with narrative, with idealized form. Celtic art was predominantly abstract, or at least non-naturalistic, concerned with pattern, with movement, with the revelation of hidden correspondences, with the suggestion of things that could not be directly depicted. It expressed a different way of seeing the world, a different philosophical orientation toward the visible and the invisible. The Celts did not, as a rule, represent their gods in human form before contact with the Roman world. This is a profound difference from the classical tradition that is worth dwelling on. For the Greeks and Romans, the gods were essentially superhuman, human in form, human in psychology, different only in their power and immortality. For the Celts, the divine was something more radically other, something that could be evoked and approached through symbol and ritual, but not pinned down in a fixed physical form. The aniconic tradition, the avoidance of divine images, that characterizes early Celtic religion across Europe speaks to a theological sensibility that was in some ways more sophisticated than the anthropomorphism of the classical tradition, more aware of the inadequacy of any particular representation to capture the nature of what it pointed toward. This theological sophistication extended to cosmology. The Druids, according to Caesar and other classical sources, were deeply interested in astronomy and in the natural world. They studied the stars. They tracked the movements of heavenly bodies. They maintained a calendar that structured the sacred year around key astronomical events. The Coligny calendar, a bronze-inscribed tablet found in France in 1897 and dating to the 1st or 2nd century CE, is the most detailed surviving document of a Celtic calendar system, and its complexity is remarkable. A lunisolar calendar synchronizing solar and lunar cycles with a sophistication that required centuries of astronomical observation to develop. The British Druids worked within the same or closely related tradition, and the astronomical alignments of the great prehistoric monuments, Stonehenge most famously, but also dozens of smaller stone circles and earthworks across the island, suggest that this tradition of celestial observation stretched back far beyond the Iron Age. The sacred landscape of pre-Roman Britain was one in which the natural and the supernatural, the visible and the invisible, were not separated by a hard boundary. Water was particularly sacred. Rivers, lakes, springs, and bogs were understood as places where the boundary between this world and the other world was especially permeable, and they received enormous quantities of votive offerings over many centuries. The practice of depositing valuable objects in water, the Battersea shield, the Waterloo helmet, countless swords and shields and cauldrons and personal ornaments, was not an act of disposal or concealment, but an act of communication, of gift-giving, of relationship maintenance with the powers of the other world. The objects returned to the water, to the place from which they came, completing a cycle of exchange between the human and the divine. This is why so many of the finest objects of Iron Age British art have been found in rivers and bogs, rather than in settlements or burial mounds. The Thames was a particularly significant sacred river, and the concentration of extraordinary objects recovered from its bed over the past 2 centuries is testimony to the intensity of ritual activity associated with it over many centuries. Excavating the Thames is, in a sense, excavating a great temple, one that has no walls, no floor plan, no architectural remains, but that received offerings of extraordinary quality and quantity over a period of more than 1,000 years. The bog bodies of Britain and Ireland add another dimension to this picture of sacred landscape. Preserved by the anaerobic chemistry of peat bogs, the bodies of people sacrificed or ritually killed over the Iron Age millennium have survived in remarkable condition, giving us direct, visceral access to individuals from the pre-Roman world. Lindau Man, found in a Cheshire bog in 1984, is the best-known British example. He was a man of perhaps 25 years, physically healthy, with well-manicured fingernails, who died around the time of the Roman conquest. From a combination of blows to the head, a garrote around the throat, and drowning. He had been subjected to what scholars have called the triple death, a form of ritual killing attested in several Celtic and later Norse traditions, in which the victim died from multiple causes simultaneously. His last meal, preserved in his stomach, was a charred flatbread that contained traces of mistletoe pollen, mistletoe being one of the sacred plants most closely associated with Druidic ritual practice. His death was not murder in any ordinary sense. It was something more complex, more deliberate, more fraught with meaning. It was, in the context of its time and place, a sacred act. The Roman conquest began in earnest in 43 CE, though it had been preceded by Julius Caesar's 2 expeditions in 55 and 54 BCE. Caesar's expeditions were raids rather than conquests. He penetrated the southeast, defeated the Catuvellauni king Cassivellaunus, received formal submission from a coalition of tribes, and left. Britain was too distant, too expensive to hold, and the political situation in Rome too pressing. But he had demonstrated that Britain could be reached, and that its tribes could be intimidated, and he had gathered intelligence that would prove useful when the actual conquest came nearly a century later. The Claudian invasion of 43 CE was motivated by a combination of factors, some strategic and some personal. Claudius needed a military triumph to consolidate his shaky political position. He had come to power in the chaotic aftermath of Caligula's assassination and was viewed with condescension by the Roman aristocracy, who saw him as an unlikely and slightly ridiculous emperor. Britain offered the prospect of an exotic, prestigious conquest at relatively manageable cost. There were also genuine strategic arguments. The island was a source of significant wealth in metals, grain, and slaves, and it was a refuge for political exiles from Gaul who used it as a base for agitation against Roman rule. And the internal politics of southern Britain, where the expansion of the Catuvellauni under Cunobelinus and his sons Togodumnus and Caratacus had disrupted the balance of power and driven the Atrebatan king Verica to seek Roman support, provided a pretext for intervention. The invasion force of 4 legions, approximately 40,000 fighting men, plus auxiliaries and support, landed on the Kent coast and advanced rapidly into the interior. The Catuvellauni offered the most serious initial resistance, but their army was defeated in a 2-day battle at a river crossing that most scholars identify with the Medway in Kent. Togodumnus was killed. Caratacus retreated westward, where he would continue resistance for nearly a decade before his eventual capture and transportation to Rome, where his dignified behavior before the Emperor Claudius reportedly so impressed the Senate that his life was spared and he was allowed to live out his days in Italy. His story is one of the most remarkable human stories of the conquest. A British king, speaking through an interpreter in the palace of the empire that had destroyed his world, declining to grovel and instead making a speech about the nature of conquest and the nature of human dignity that the Romans themselves recorded, with what seems like genuine admiration. But Caratacus was the exception. Most of the resistance was suppressed with the systematic brutality that Roman military operations typically employed. The legions moved across the south and west, establishing forts, building roads, garrisoning key points, and destroying centers of resistance. Maiden Castle was stormed. The excavation of the Maiden Castle War Cemetery, where the defenders who died in the Roman assault were hastily buried, produced one of the most haunting images in British archaeology. A young man buried with a Roman ballista bolt still lodged in his spine. The iron and bone fused together over 2,000 years into a single object that speaks of violence and ending with extraordinary directness. Vespasian, later emperor, commanded the Second Legion in the conquest of the south and west, reportedly storming more than 20 hill forts. Each of those hill forts was a community, people with names and families and histories and prayers and a sense of their place in the world. Each one was taken by force, and its inhabitants subjected to whatever the Roman army, in the heat of conquest, chose to do to them. The historical record does not preserve the details of most of these events. The names of the communities are not known. Their stories are gone. The road building that followed conquest was not merely a practical military measure, though it served that purpose efficiently. It was a transformation of the landscape itself, a remapping of Britain according to Roman logic. Straight lines imposed on a country that had previously been navigated along routes following the contours of the land, the ridgelines and river valleys and ancient tracks that the pre-Roman population had walked for generations. The Roman roads cut across this older geography, linking not the sacred sites and communal meeting places of the indigenous tradition, but the new military and administrative centers that the conquest created. They were, among other things, a statement about whose geography mattered, whose understanding of the landscape had authority. The construction of Roman towns over or near major pre-Roman settlements was similarly meaningful. Camulodunum, the great oppidum of the Catuvellauni, became Colonia Victresensis, the first Roman colony in Britain, populated initially by retired legionary soldiers. Verulamium, the old Catuvellauni site near St. Albans, became a Roman municipium. The new towns had forums and basilicas and temples to Roman gods, bathhouses and amphitheatres and triumphal arches. They were built not just for practical administrative purposes, but as demonstrations of what civilization looked like, as physical arguments for the superiority of the Roman way of life. The indigenous population was not excluded from these towns. Increasingly, over the generations of occupation, British people adopted Roman names, Roman dress, Roman languages, and Roman religious practices. But the framework within which they did so was defined and controlled by the conquerors, and what they were invited to adopt was never their own tradition transformed, but their own tradition replaced. The suppression of Druidism was the most deliberately destructive element of the conquest. The attack on Anglesey was not an isolated military action, but the culmination of a systematic campaign to eliminate the institutional infrastructure of the Celtic tradition. The groves were destroyed, the practitioners were killed or dispersed, the training centres were broken up. The networks of transmission through which accumulated knowledge moved from generation to generation were severed. And the knowledge itself, the astronomical calculations, the medical practice, the legal precedent, the theological doctrine, the historical tradition, the vast oral literature of poem and story and song, went with the practitioners into silence and earth. It is worth trying to imagine the scale of what was lost. Consider a civilization that had been accumulating and transmitting knowledge for several thousand years. Consider that this knowledge was held not in libraries or universities, institutions that can be destroyed, but whose physical contents can sometimes be recovered, but in the minds of a dedicated class of trained specialists whose entire social function was the preservation and transmission of that knowledge. Consider that those specialists trained for 20 years, meaning that in any given generation, only a small number of practitioners reached full competence. Consider that when those practitioners were killed and their training communities were destroyed, there was no recovery possible, because the knowledge had no physical form that could survive its human bearers. The destruction of the Druidic tradition was in informational terms equivalent to burning every library in Britain simultaneously. But it was worse than that, because libraries can be rebuilt from copies and fragments. The knowledge in the Druids' minds had no copies. There were no fragments. When they died, it died. Some of it survived in transformed and fragmentary form. The Welsh bardic tradition, which maintained something of the pre-Roman Celtic literary tradition through the Roman period and into the medieval era, preserved stories and mythological materials that clearly draw on very old sources. The Mabinogion, the collection of Welsh myths and tales set down in the 11th and 12th centuries, but preserving material of much greater antiquity, contains echoes of the cosmological and mythological tradition that the Druids maintained. The figure of Merlin, Myrddin in Welsh, is widely understood by scholars as a transformation of the Druidic archetype, the wise man of the forest who mediates between the human world and the other world. The Arthurian cycle as a whole, whatever its ultimate historical basis, is saturated with Celtic mythological motifs that trace back to the pre-Roman tradition. In Ireland, which was never conquered by Rome, the situation was more favourable to preservation. The Druidic tradition in Ireland continued until the coming of Christianity in the 5th century CE, and when Christianity arrived, the relationship between the new faith and the old tradition was complex and in some respects more accommodating than the Roman policy of simple elimination. Irish monks and scholars, working in their extraordinary scriptoria in the 6th and 7th and 8th centuries, preserved vast quantities of pre-Christian material. Mythology, law, poetry, genealogy, history, by writing it down in Latin script. The great mythological cycles of Ireland, the Ulster cycle, the mythological cycle, the Fenian cycle, survive because of this monastic preservation project, and they preserve, in transmuted form, a tradition that was closely related to the Brythonic Celtic tradition of pre-Roman Britain. But Ireland is not Britain. What survived in Ireland gives us valuable comparative material and suggests something of what was lost in Britain, but it does not recover what was lost. The British tradition had its own character, its own emphasis, its own mythological actors and cosmological narratives shaped by the specific landscape and ecology and history of the island. Whatever Stonehenge meant to its builders and to the long tradition of sacred practice that continued at the site for millennia, we do not know. Whatever the sacred groves of Britain contained, theologically, philosophically, cosmologically, we do not know. Whatever the legal and social principles that the British Druids maintained and transmitted across centuries of tribal life actually were, we do not know. The Romans told us what to think about the people they conquered, and for a very long time we largely believed them. The word barbarian, used constantly in Roman texts to describe the Celts, carries such powerful negative associations that it has coloured interpretation of the archaeological evidence for centuries. Even when the evidence clearly demonstrated sophistication, the complexity of the hill forts, the quality of the metalwork, the scale of the oppida, the evidence of long-distance trade, there was a persistent tendency to qualify and contextualize it in ways that preserved the fundamental Roman narrative of civilization arriving in an uncivilized land. We could admire the Battersea Shield while still thinking of its makers as somehow less than fully civilized. We could acknowledge the complexity of Maiden Castle while still framing the Roman assault on it as essentially a civilizing act. The categories themselves, civilized, barbaric, advanced, primitive, were Roman categories, designed by Romans to serve Roman interests, and we inherited them with our inheritance of the Roman world. The rethinking of Iron Age Britain that has been underway since the 1970s, driven by a new generation of archaeologists approaching the evidence without the classical, literary sources as their primary interpretive framework, and accelerating dramatically in recent decades with the application of new scientific techniques, has produced a picture that is fundamentally different from the traditional account. The evidence now available shows a society of genuine complexity and sophistication, with a rich material culture, a developed economic system, significant urban centers, a complex religious and philosophical tradition, and a long historical memory extending back thousands of years. It was not Rome. It did not need to be Rome. It was something else, something with its own deep internal logic and its own forms of excellence. And the question of whether it was more or less advanced than Rome is not only unanswerable, but the wrong question entirely. The genetic history of the British population adds another layer to this story that has become much clearer in the past decade. Ancient DNA analysis has now produced a detailed picture of population continuity and change in Britain from the Neolithic onwards, and what it shows is that the population living in Britain today is, in its genetic foundations, largely descended from the people who were living in Britain before the Roman conquest. The Romans came, governed, built, taxed, suppressed, and left, and the genetic impact of their presence, while detectable, is relatively modest. The Brythonic Celtic population of pre-Roman Britain did not disappear. They were not replaced by Romans. They continued to live on the land, to farm it and graze it and work it, to have children and die and be buried in it, and their descendants are the genetic majority in the population of modern Britain. Welsh and Cornish and Cumbric and other Brythonic languages, direct descendants of the language of the pre-Roman Britons, survived the Roman occupation and the subsequent Anglo-Saxon settlement of lowland England to persist to the present day. Welsh is spoken by more than 500,000 people. The language itself is a thread of direct continuity, reaching back more than 2,000 years, to the time before the legions arrived and after they left. When a Welsh speaker forms a sentence today, the grammatical structures they use, the phonological patterns of the sounds they make, the words they speak, many of them ancient, are the same structures and patterns and words that a Briton was using in the time of Boudicca. The language is not a relic or a reconstruction. It is a living organism, more than 2 millennia old, carrying within its structure a memory of a world that Rome tried to erase. Place names are another layer of this buried continuity. The names of rivers in Britain are, in many cases, among the oldest surviving words in the linguistic record of the island. The Thames, the Avon, the Severn, the Exe, the Wye, these names are British, pre-Roman, derived from the Celtic languages, and in some cases possibly even older. They were simply too embedded in the practical life of the landscape, too necessary, too deeply associated with particular places in people's experience, to be replaced even by centuries of Roman, then Anglo-Saxon, then Norman overlay. Every time a place name in Britain ends in combe or pen or tor or avon or begins with aber or kea or tre, we are hearing an echo of the pre-Roman world, a word preserved by the sheer inertia of geographic reference across 2,000 years and multiple waves of linguistic change. The sacred sites of pre-Roman Britain similarly persisted, transformed but not erased, through the subsequent layers of British history. The pattern by which Christian churches were built on or near pre-Christian sacred sites is well attested across Britain and Ireland. A policy of assimilation rather than elimination that was recognized by Pope Gregory the Great in a letter to Augustine of Canterbury in 601 CE, in which he advised that rather than destroying temples and sacred places, they should be converted to Christian use, because people would more easily come to new practices if they continued to use familiar places. The great network of springs and wells that had been sacred in the Celtic tradition became holy wells with Christian patron saints, their healing properties now attributed to the saint rather than to the pre-Christian deity, but the fundamental ritual practice, the pilgrimage, the offering, the prayer, the expectation of healing, continuing largely unchanged. Pilgrims still leave offerings at holy wells across Britain and Ireland, still tie ribbons and rags to the trees beside them, still drop coins into their depths, repeating a gesture of propitiation and hope that stretches back beyond Christianity, beyond Rome, into a past too deep to fully see. The long tradition of scholarship that has tried to recover the pre-Roman British world operates under a fundamental paradox. The more successful it is, the more clearly it reveals the scale of what is unrecoverable. The new archaeology has given us an extraordinary amount: the social complexity, the material culture, the settlement patterns, the trade networks, the physical evidence of lives and deaths and communities. But it cannot give us the inner world of those communities. It cannot give us the theology, the philosophy, the mythology, the law, the poetry, the specific texture of how it felt to be a person in pre-Roman Britain, what the world meant to you, how you understood your place in it, what you prayed for, and what you feared, and what you believed happened to you when you died. That inner world existed. It was real. It was the product of thousands of years of human thinking and feeling and experiencing, refined and developed and transmitted with great care and intention. And it is gone. The loss is not simply a loss for academic history, it is a loss for the human story. The tradition that the Druids maintained represented a particular way of being human in the world, a way of relating to the natural world, to the dead, to the divine, to the community, to time. And that was the product of deep intelligence and long experience. It had things to say, or rather, it had things it knew, that were specific to it and not available from any other source. And we will never hear them. The Roman Empire itself is long gone. The legions that destroyed the Druidic tradition are gone. The emperors who ordered the suppression of Celtic religion are gone. The roads still run, more or less, under the modern roads that follow their lines. The foundations of Roman buildings lie under modern cities, but the empire itself, the political and cultural project that was Rome, has been over for 16 centuries. What it built has been inherited and transformed and built over. What it destroyed cannot be rebuilt, because it was not built in stone, but in mines, and the mines are gone. There is a question that the story of pre-Roman Britain inevitably raises, and it is not a comfortable question. How many other traditions, how many other ways of being human, how many other systems of knowledge and understanding and practice have been destroyed by the advance of imperial power, of one civilization's conviction that its way of understanding the world is not just one possible way, but the only legitimate way? The answer, of course, is that we cannot fully know, because the destruction of a tradition includes the destruction of the evidence of the tradition's destruction. Rome left records of what it did to the Celts, because Rome had a literate, record-keeping culture. Most of the traditions that were destroyed by the expansion of literate, record-keeping cultures left no such records, because they were themselves oral traditions that could not document their own erasure. The story of pre-Roman Britain is, in this sense, a rare and valuable case study, a tradition whose destruction we can partially document, whose existence we can partially reconstruct, whose sophistication we can to some degree appreciate. It serves as a reminder, not a comfortable one, that the story of human progress, of civilization advancing from the primitive to the sophisticated, from the simple to the complex, from the local to the universal, is a story told by the winners of a particular kind of contest. It is a story that systematically devalues and erases the traditions of the losers, including traditions that were, in their own terms, neither primitive nor simple, nor merely local, but were rather genuinely different expressions of human intelligence and human experience. The people who built Stonehenge were not savages. The people who created the Battersea Shield were not barbarians. The Druids who memorized 20 years of accumulated wisdom and transmitted it across generations in carefully tended oral tradition were not superstitious primitives. They were human beings of remarkable intelligence and capability, living in a world of great sophistication and depth, connected by long threads of cultural memory to ancestors who had been building and thinking and worshipping on this island for thousands of years before them. The silence that followed them is not a natural silence. It is an imposed one, and part of the work of honest history is to stand in that silence, to refuse to accept it as simply the way things were, and to try, even knowing the limits of what can be recovered, to hear something in it of what was lost. Before we reach the final reckoning of what was lost, there is more to be understood about how that loss unfolded, and about the remarkable tenacity with which the people of this island resisted it. The Roman conquest was not a single event. It was a process that lasted decades, consumed enormous resources, and was never, in the full 4 centuries of Roman Britain, truly complete. The north of England was never pacified in the Roman sense. Wales was subdued, but never fully absorbed. Scotland, which the Romans called Caledonia, was the subject of multiple campaigns that never resulted in lasting occupation. The Caledonian tribes, the ancestors of the later Picts, inflicted sufficiently severe defeats on Roman armies that the emperors Hadrian and Antoninus Pius found it more practical to build walls across the width of northern Britain than to continue trying to conquer the land beyond them. Hadrian's Wall, stretching 73 miles from Wallsend in the east to Bowness-on-Solway in the west, is the most visible surviving Roman structure in Britain and one of the most dramatic military constructions in the ancient world. It was built beginning around 122 CE, 2 generations after the initial conquest, and it speaks very clearly to the limits of Roman ambition and Roman power in Britain. The land beyond the wall remained, for the Romans, a zone of threat and mystery, a place where the old ways held, where Druidic influence may have survived longer, where the people had never submitted and never would. The building of the wall also tells us something about the nature of the communities on either side of it. The Brigantes, the largest tribal confederation in Britain, whose territory covered most of what is now Yorkshire, Lancashire, County Durham, and Cumbria, had initially been Rome's allies. Their queen Cartimandua had famously handed Caratacus over to the Romans after he sought refuge with her, earning herself Roman protection and presumably gifts and political support. But the relationship deteriorated. Internal tensions within the Brigantes between pro-Roman and anti-Roman factions eventually resulted in Cartimandua's deposition and exile, and Rome found itself committed to a full military occupation of Brigantian territory rather than the more comfortable arrangement of a client kingdom. The legionary fortress at York, Eboracum, became the principal military base for northern Britain and the effective capital of the north, the city from which Rome attempted to control a territory that had never wanted to be controlled. The Brigantes are a fascinating case study in the ambiguity of resistance and accommodation. Their tribal area encompasses some of the most dramatic and inaccessible landscape in Britain: the High Pennines, the Yorkshire Dales, the Lake District fells, and these upland zones served for generations as refuges where Roman administrative authority was largely nominal. The Roman road system in the north was primarily military rather than commercial, designed to move troops rapidly rather than to facilitate civilian economic activity. Beyond the roads and the forts, in the farms and hamlets of the uplands, something of the old social organization The old language, the old religious practices, must have persisted for generations, far from the eyes of Roman administrators and the influence of Roman towns. The story of Roman Britain and its relationship with the indigenous population is not, in any case, simply a story of oppression and resistance. It is a more complex story of negotiation, adaptation, and selective adoption, in which the indigenous population made choices, sometimes under coercion, sometimes freely, about what elements of Roman culture to take up and how to integrate them with what they already had. The so-called Romanization of Britain, a process that has occupied scholars for generations, is now understood as far less straightforward than the term suggests. There was no simple transition from Celtic to Roman, no moment when the indigenous population simply became Roman. What happened instead was a long, varied, regionally differentiated process of cultural mixing and selective adoption, in which local traditions were not simply replaced, but transformed through contact with the incoming culture. The religious life of Roman Britain illustrates this beautifully. The Romans brought their gods, Jupiter, Mars, Minerva, Mercury, the imperial cult, and built temples to them in their new towns and cities. But they also tolerated, and in many cases actively accommodated, the indigenous religious tradition, partly because Roman religious policy was generally inclusive rather than exclusive, and partly because they recognized the practical importance of local religious sentiment as a stabilizing force. The result was a proliferation of hybrid divine figures, Roman divine names fused with Celtic divine names, creating composite deities that satisfied both Roman administrative requirements and indigenous religious sensibility. Mars Cocidius, worshipped in the northwest of England, was Mars fused with a local deity of the hunt or of warfare. Coventina, worshipped at a well at Carabur on Hadrian's Wall, was a local water goddess accommodated within the Roman religious framework. At Bath, the site of a major hot spring that had been a sacred site long before the Romans arrived, the goddess Sulis was identified with Minerva, and the Romans built there one of the most elaborate religious complexes in all of Roman Britain. A temple, a sacred spring, elaborate bathing facilities around a sacred site that had been honored for centuries before they arrived. The offerings deposited in the sacred spring at Bath over the centuries of Roman occupation number in the thousands. Coins, jewelry, lead curse tablets, and various other objects thrown into the water as appeals to the goddess. The lead curse tablets are particularly revealing documents of the inner life of the Roman British population. They are prayers inscribed on lead sheets, rolled up and thrown into the sacred spring, asking the goddess Sulis Minerva to curse whoever had stolen the writer's property or wronged them in some way. They are written in Latin because Latin was the administrative and commercial language of Roman Britain, but many of them contain Celtic names, the names of the people making the curse, the names of the people being cursed, and they invoke a goddess whose name is Celtic, asking for a kind of divine intervention that is entirely consistent with the pre-Roman tradition of sacred water as a place of communication between the human and the divine. These are documents that exist in two worlds simultaneously, that speak Latin in the syntax of a Celtic understanding of the sacred, that demonstrate the persistence of the indigenous tradition within the framework of Roman culture. The material wealth of Roman Britain, built on the exploitation of the island's natural resources and the labour of its indigenous population, was substantial. Britain was an important source of metals. Lead, silver extracted from lead ore, iron, tin, gold, and the Romans developed the extractive industries on a scale that far exceeded anything in the pre-Roman tradition. The lead mining districts of the Mendips in Somerset, the Derbyshire Peak District, and Flintshire in North Wales were worked intensively from the first decades of occupation. The gold mines at Dolaucothi in Wales where the remains of Roman hydraulic mining operations are still visible, produced gold for the imperial treasury. The agricultural production of the lowland zones was organized to supply the Roman army and to generate export surplus of grain. Britain fed legions stationed on the Rhine frontier and contributed to the general economic metabolism of the empire. The British population that produced this wealth did so in conditions that varied enormously by region, status, and time. At the top of the social hierarchy, the indigenous aristocracy that accommodated Roman power, those who took Latin names, built Roman-style villas, served as magistrates in the new towns, entertained Roman officials with imported wine in rooms decorated with Mediterranean-style wall paintings, lived in considerable comfort and, in some cases, considerable splendor. The villa estates of the later Roman period, particularly in the 4th century, when Roman Britain reached its economic peak, could be architecturally elaborate, with mosaic floors, underfloor heating, bathing facilities, and luxury goods from across the empire. These were not the homes of people who felt conquered. They were the homes of people who had, in the most pragmatic sense, made their peace with the world as it was and found ways to prosper within it. But below the villa-owning elite, the experience of Roman Britain was very different. The colony, tenant farmers tied to the land they worked, effectively serfs, who worked the great agricultural estates were indigenous Britons whose social condition had, if anything, deteriorated from the relative freedom of the Iron Age tribal system. The workers in the mines had no choice about their labor. The slaves, and Roman Britain was a slave-owning society of the same character as the rest of the empire, were often indigenous people, taken in the initial conquest or its aftermath, or their descendants. The people who built the roads and the walls and the towns were largely not Roman. They were British. The towns themselves, for all their grandeur, were in significant ways alien impositions on the landscape. The pre-Roman tradition of settlement was not urban in the Roman sense. Even the large oppida were more like extended markets and administrative zones than towns in the sense of dense residential centers of specialized labor. Roman towns required a different relationship to space, to movement, to the separation of public and private, to time regulated by the civic calendar rather than the agricultural and sacred calendar. For the first generations of the Roman period, there is archaeological evidence that the indigenous population was reluctant to move into the new towns. The buildings that housed the administrative and commercial functions were occupied, but the residential zones of the early Roman towns were often sparsely inhabited by the indigenous population. The towns were, in a sense, a Roman argument about how life should be organized, and the indigenous population was not always convinced. Understanding the social texture of Roman Britain requires engaging with the evidence on its own terms rather than through the filter of the Roman literary sources. Roman writers occasionally mention Britain and its people, but they do so from the perspective of the center, looking toward the periphery, the civilized world, describing the edge of civilization, and what they describe is inevitably shaped by their own assumptions and preoccupations. Tacitus, who is our most important literary source for the early Roman period in Britain, was writing biography and history in the classical mode, using Britain and its people as a backdrop for the story of his father-in-law, Gnaeus Julius Agricola, whose governorship of Britain from 77 to 84 CE was the subject of Tacitus's earliest work. The Agricola is an invaluable source, but it is also a panegyric. It is designed to celebrate Agricola's achievements, and Britain is present in it primarily as the arena in which those achievements were demonstrated. Tacitus does, however, give us one of the most remarkable speeches in ancient literature. The speech that he attributes to the Caledonian chief Calgacus, delivered before the Battle of Mons Graupius in 83 CE, the decisive engagement in which Agricola defeated the northern tribes and pushed Roman power to its furthest extent in Scotland. Calgacus, addressing his warriors before the battle, says things about the nature of Roman power that no Roman writer would have chosen to articulate in their own voice. He speaks of the Romans as the robbers of the world, who, when there is no more land to plunder, go to sea. He observes that they make a desert and call it peace. He describes the reality of Roman rule, the extraction, the forced labor, the taxation, the conscription, in terms that cut through the official propaganda of civilization and progress with uncomfortable clarity. Tacitus put these words in Calgacus's mouth. He wrote them in Latin. He was a Roman senator writing for a Roman audience. That he chose to articulate this critique at all, through the voice of an enemy, tells us something important about the complexity of Roman self-awareness. That within the Roman intellectual tradition, there was a capacity to see, at least occasionally and at least obliquely, what empire actually meant for those on whom it was imposed. But it also tells us that Calgacus's perspective, whatever words he actually used to his warriors on that Scottish hillside, has reached us only in a form mediated and rewritten by the culture that was his enemy. The voice of the conquered is always, in the historical record of Rome, a voice that has passed through Roman hands. The Battle of Mons Graupius, which Tacitus presents as a great Roman victory, and it was, tactically, resulted in no lasting Roman occupation of Scotland. Agricola was recalled to Rome, and within a few years, the Roman army pulled back from the positions he had established. Scotland remained beyond the empire. The Picts, the painted people, as the Romans called them, a name derived from their tradition of body painting or tattooing, maintained their independence throughout the entire Roman period, occasionally raiding south of the walls with such violence that they had to be bought off or driven back, never subjugated. The Pictish tradition, which developed in Scotland during the Roman and post-Roman period, produced one of the most enigmatic bodies of art in European history. The Pictish symbol stones, carved with complex geometric and zoomorphic symbols, whose meaning has never been convincingly decoded. These stones, standing in the landscape of eastern and northern Scotland, are the material record of a tradition that was entirely self-generated, developed in the space that Rome never occupied, and they carry their secrets still. The Roman occupation of Britain lasted, in formal terms, until around 410 CE, when the Emperor Honorius, faced with the Gothic sack of Rome itself and the disintegration of the Western Empire, reportedly told the cities of Britain to look to their own defense. This is generally taken as the formal end of Roman Britain, though the reality was messier. There had been a progressive withdrawal of military and administrative personnel from Britain throughout the late 4th century as the empire struggled with crises on multiple fronts, and by 410, the Roman administrative and military presence in Britain was already greatly diminished. What remained were the towns, the villas, the road system, the infrastructure, and the population, the millions of people who had been living on this island throughout the Roman period and who would continue to live on it through whatever came next. What came next was the post-Roman period that has come to be called, with varying degrees of enthusiasm and accuracy, the Dark Ages, a phrase that reflects not actual ignorance on the part of the people living through it, but rather the relative scarcity of written evidence available to later historians trying to understand it. This was the period in which the Anglo-Saxons, Germanic settlers from what is now northern Germany and Denmark, began arriving in significant numbers in the east of Britain, gradually expanding westward, replacing or absorbing the Romano-British population in the lowlands, while the upland and western zones maintained their Brythonic Celtic character. It was the period of Arthur, whoever or whatever Arthur actually was, and of the warrior kings who fought to maintain something of the Roman-British world against the pressure of the new arrivals. It was the period in which the Celtic languages retreated westward and northward into Wales and Cornwall and Cumbria and Scotland, where they were eventually confined as the Germanic languages of the Anglo-Saxons came to dominate the lowland East. And it was in this period, in the monasteries of Ireland and Wales and the Celtic North, that the most important work of preservation was done. The Irish monastic tradition, emerging in the 5th and 6th centuries under the influence of figures like Columba and Brendan and Columbanus, created a network of scriptoria in which the written word was treated with extraordinary reverence and the copying of texts was understood as a form of prayer. It was in these scriptoria that the pre-Christian mythology and history of the Celtic world was preserved, not in its original form, not by practitioners of the tradition it described, but by Christian monks who recognized the value of what they were recording, even as they framed it within a Christian interpretive context. The Welsh tradition was slightly different, but equally important. The earliest Welsh poetry, the poems attributed to the 6th century bards Taliesin and Aneurin, is not mythology, but heroic verse, celebrating the warriors and kings of the post-Roman Brythonic North in a tradition of praise poetry that clearly descended from the pre-Roman bardic tradition. When Aneurin composed Why Gododin, his great lament for the warriors of the Gododin tribe, who died in a disastrous raid on Anglo-Saxon Catrith around 600 CE, he was working in a poetic tradition that stretched back to the Iron Age bards who had composed praise poetry for tribal kings and warriors in a form that the Druids had maintained and taught. The meters, the formulaic phrases, the aristocratic values embedded in the poetry, all of these carry echoes of the pre-Roman world, refracted through 4 centuries of Roman occupation and another century of post-Roman crisis and change. The figure of Taliesin is particularly fascinating in this context because the mythological material associated with him, which is much later than the historical Taliesin, but clearly draws on very ancient traditions, presents the poet as a kind of successor to the Druidic archetype, a figure of magical knowledge and shape-shifting ability connected to the other world, capable of transformation and revelation. The Haines Taliesin, the story of the poet's magical rebirth as a figure of universal knowledge after being accidentally consumed by the witch Ceridwen, is widely understood by scholars as a mythologized account of Druidic initiation, the ordeal of transformation through which a practitioner acquired the knowledge and identity of the tradition. It is a story about how knowledge is transmitted, about the conditions under which a human being can become a vessel for accumulated wisdom, and it preserves, in the language of myth, something of the epistemology of the Druidic tradition, its understanding of how wisdom worked and how it was obtained. The Mabinogion, the great collection of Welsh tales that provides our most substantial window into the mythological world of pre-Roman Britain, was committed to writing in the 11th and 12th centuries, but preserves material of much greater antiquity. The 4 branches of the Mabinogi, the stories of Pwyll, Branwen, Manawydan, and Math, are set in a mythological version of Wales and the other world that clearly reflects a very old understanding of the landscape and its sacred geography. The figures who move through these stories, Rhiannon, who arrives from the other world on a white horse, Pryderi, born under mysterious circumstances and stolen away at birth, Branwen, daughter of Lair, whose story drives Britain and Ireland to war, Arianrhod and Gwydion and Math, whose interactions in the 4th branch describe a world in which magic and politics and kinship are inextricably entangled. These are not simply characters in entertaining stories. They are survivors, in transformed and fragmentary form, of the cosmological and mythological tradition that the Druids maintained. The Welsh mythological tradition, and to a lesser extent, the Arthurian cycle which grew from it, preserved a map of the pre-Roman British sacred landscape. Not a physical map, but a conceptual one, a map of the places and figures and stories around which the spiritual life of the indigenous tradition was organised. Anendobrowen, the Welsh otherworld, is not a place in the sky or underground in any simple sense, but a realm that exists in parallel with the physical world, accessible through certain liminal spaces, bodies of water, hilltops, forest edges, and at certain liminal times, the great turning points of the year, the spaces between day and night. The pre-Roman Britons' understanding of the sacred geography of their island was an understanding of where and when these liminal spaces occurred, where the membrane between this world and the other world was thinnest, where prayer and offering and ceremony could most effectively cross the boundary. This understanding did not disappear with the Romans. It went underground, survived in the oral tradition of rural communities, resurfaced in modified forms in the stories that were eventually written down, and persist to this day in the folk traditions, the local legends, the holy wells and fairy mounds and haunted hills that still populate the landscape of Wales and Cornwall and Scotland and Ireland and even, in attenuated form, of England. Every English county has its local legends of fairies and bogarts and kelpies and will-o'-the-wisps, its stories of the dead returning, its tales of places where strange things happen at certain times of year. These are not random superstitions. They are the last echo of a cosmological tradition, 2,000 years old, preserved in stories because the stories were too good to be forgotten, even after their theological framework was dismantled. The archaeology of the late and post-Roman period in Britain has revealed something that complicates the standard narrative of the end of Roman Britain in ways that are still being worked out. The collapse of Roman administrative and economic structures was rapid and apparently devastating. The use of coinage, the production of wheel-thrown pottery, the maintenance of stone buildings, the keeping of written records, all of these ceased or dramatically contracted within a generation or two of the formal end of Roman rule. What had been one of the most materially developed provinces of the Western Empire rapidly reverted, in material terms, to something resembling the pre-Roman Iron Age. Towns shrank or were abandoned. Villa estates fell into disrepair. The road system persisted, but was no longer maintained. The great infrastructure of Roman civilization, which had been imposed on Britain from outside and maintained by the connection to the wider imperial economy, dissolved when that connection was severed. What this suggests is that the Roman civilization of Britain was, in an important sense, a surface phenomenon, impressive and durable enough to persist for 4 centuries, but ultimately dependent on inputs and connections that could not be maintained once the empire itself contracted. When Roman Britain ended, what remained beneath it was something more durable. The indigenous population, in its millions, speaking its Celtic languages, maintaining its local communities, farming its fields, telling its stories, remembering, however imperfectly and partially, something of the world that had existed before the legions came. The buildings fell, the roads cracked, the Latin inscriptions weathered, but the people were still there, still rooted in the land, still carrying in their genes and their languages and their stories, the traces of a tradition that had been building on this island for thousands of years. It is this people, the post-Roman, Celtic-speaking Britons of the 5th and 6th centuries, who are the direct ancestors of the Welsh and Cornish and Cumbrian populations of today, and through the complex processes of Anglo-Saxon settlement and Norman conquest and subsequent migration and intermarriage, of a significant proportion of the broader British population. The genetic ancestry studies have made this clear in ways that previous scholarship could only partially appreciate. The Celtic-speaking Britons of the pre-Roman and Roman periods did not disappear. They were partially absorbed by incoming populations. Yes, the Anglo-Saxons, the Normans, and others, but they continued in sufficient numbers to constitute a substantial and, in some regions, dominant genetic lineage in the modern British population. The Welsh language, which has been spoken continuously on this island since before the Romans arrived, is the clearest evidence of this continuity. It is a language that has been spoken in Britain for at least 2,500 years and probably significantly longer. The gap between the Proto-Celtic ancestor of Welsh and the Welsh spoken today is not significantly greater than the gap between the Proto-Germanic ancestor of English and modern English, and yet we do not typically think of English as an ancient language in the way we think of Welsh. The antiquity of Welsh is a function of where it survived, in the mountainous west, beyond the reach of successive waves of lowland settlement and cultural replacement. But its antiquity is real, and what it represents is a thread of unbroken human presence and cultural continuity, stretching back to a time before the Roman Empire existed. When Welsh speakers today use the word neph for heaven, they are using a word that is cognate with the Sanskrit naba and the Latin nebula, a word inherited from the common Proto-Indo-European ancestor language that was already ancient when the Bronze Age began. When they use the word aphon for river, they are using a word that was already being used by the people who built the great hill forts of the Iron Age, who prayed at the riverside and threw their most precious objects into the water as gifts for the divine. When they sing in the Eisteddfod tradition, the festival of Welsh language and culture that has been held continuously since at least the 12th century, and probably much longer, they are participating in a performance tradition that connects, through centuries of adaptation and change, to the bardic tradition that the Druids maintained and protected and transmitted in the years before the legions came. None of this is to romanticize what the pre-Roman world was, or to suggest that it was in some simple way better than what followed it. The Iron Age was a time of endemic tribal warfare, of social hierarchies that could be brutal, of religious practices that included, at least sometimes, human sacrifice. The Druids were not sages above politics and power. They were deeply embedded in the political life of Celtic society, using their authority and their knowledge in the service of particular interests as well as in the service of the common good. The pre-Roman Britons were fully human, with all the capacity for cruelty and injustice and self-serving behavior that full humanity implies. They were not noble savages, they were people, but they were people who had something that was theirs, a tradition, a way of understanding the world, a relationship with their landscape, a cosmological framework within which their lives had meaning, and that something was destroyed, not allowed to transform itself at its own pace in response to its own internal dynamics. Not given the opportunity to encounter the Roman world as an equal and to decide on its own terms what to take from it and what to decline. Destroyed, deliberately, by force. In the service of an imperial project whose benefits accrued overwhelmingly to people who had not built what was destroyed. The history of the world is, in large measure, the history of this process repeated. The history of one tradition's encounter with a more militarily powerful tradition and the various outcomes of that encounter: absorption, transformation, resistance, preservation in fragments, or complete extinction. Britain is not a unique case. It is not even an especially extreme case by the standards of the destruction that human beings have visited on each other's cultures in the long history of expansion and conquest. But it is a case that is close to home for many people, that touches the deepest roots of an identity that millions of people carry, and that has left traces in the landscape and the language and the genetics of these islands that are, if you know how to look, everywhere. The rivers still carry British names. The hills still bear British names. And there is more to be said about the specific nature of the world those names belong to before we reach the close of this account. More about the daily texture of a civilization that has been described too often in terms of its dramatic moments and not nearly enough in terms of its ordinary life. The roundhouse was the fundamental domestic unit of pre-Roman Britain, and its ubiquity across the archaeological record says something important about the values and priorities of the people who built and lived in them. A typical Iron Age roundhouse was a circular structure, anywhere from 6 to 15 meters in diameter, with walls of wattle and daub, interwoven wooden rods plastered with a mixture of mud, clay, and animal dung, supporting a steeply pitched, thatched roof. The central hearth provided warmth and light and the means of cooking. There were no windows, or at most very small ones, and the doorway was typically oriented to the east or southeast, catching the morning sun. Inside, the space was organized radially around the hearth, with sleeping areas, storage, and working areas defined by the layout of posts and the placement of furniture. This is not a primitive dwelling. It is an extraordinarily efficient and well-adapted form of domestic architecture for the British climate. Warm, waterproof, structurally robust, easily built and maintained from locally available materials, and socially functional in ways that its circular geometry actively supported. The roundhouse had no corners. There were no separate rooms that could divide a family into isolated units. The single circular space gathered everyone around the central fire, made privacy difficult and community unavoidable. Organized domestic life around collective warmth and shared light in a way that expressed and reinforced the social values of a culture that placed enormous importance on the kinship group and its solidarity. The smell of an Iron Age roundhouse, wood smoke, roasting meat, herbs strewn on the floor to repel insects, the presence of animals sometimes sheltered in a byre at the back of the building, the particular animal and organic smell of a thatched roof wet with rain, was the smell of home for every person in pre-Roman Britain. It was the smell of safety, of warmth, of the family gathered. It was as specific and evocative and irreplaceable as any sensory experience of any culture, and it is entirely gone, leaving only post holes in the archaeological record to tell us it was ever there. The food of Iron Age Britain was considerably more varied and sophisticated than the shorthand of ancient history typically allows for. The agricultural base was diverse. Emmer and spelt wheat, barley, and later bread wheat were the principal grain crops, supplemented by rye and oats in the north and west. Peas and beans were grown. Celtic beans, a small, bitter variety of the field bean, were a dietary staple. Gardens attached to settlements produced vegetables including leeks, garlic, and various herbs. Cattle and sheep and pigs were raised for meat and dairy and wool. Horses were kept but rarely eaten, being too valuable as working and prestige animals. Hunting provided venison, wild boar, and wildfowl. Fishing, both freshwater and coastal sea fishing, was practiced wherever geography permitted. The cuisine that resulted was not elaborate in the manner of the Roman dinner party, but it was far from the monotonous gruel of popular imagination. Bread was baked from whole-grain flour on flat hearth stones and in clay ovens. Stews and porridges were made in ceramic pots suspended over the fire or in wooden vessels heated with fire-hot stones. Meat was roasted on spits or boiled in great cauldrons. The cauldron being in the Celtic tradition, not just a cooking vessel, but a potent symbol of communal sustenance and sacred hospitality. The mythological cauldron of plenty, the cauldron of rebirth, appears in Celtic mythology from Ireland to Gaul and is clearly connected to the very real social significance of the communal feast in Iron Age culture. The feast was not just a social event in pre-Roman Britain, it was a religious and political institution. The great cauldrons found in Iron Age contexts, the Gundestrup cauldron from Denmark, elaborately decorated with divine and mythological scenes, the cauldrons from British contexts that are less elaborate but no less socially central, were the vessels in which the feast was prepared, and the feast was the occasion on which the social hierarchy was dramatized and reinforced, on which gifts were given and received, on which alliances were confirmed and disputes were aired and resolved, on which the relationship between the king and the community was acted out in the concrete language of food and drink and shared space. Who sat where at the feast mattered. What portion of the animal you received, the champion's portion, the best cut, given to the warrior deemed most worthy, was a public statement about your social standing. Who was invited and who was excluded said everything about the social and political landscape of the community. Alcohol played a significant role in this ceremonial life. Beer brewed from grain, barley beer, often flavored with herbs and plants, in the absence of hops, which were not used in brewing until the medieval period, was the indigenous drink. Wine, imported from the Mediterranean via Gaul, arrived in the late Iron Age for those with the wealth and connections to access it, and its adoption by the southeastern British elite as the drink of choice for ceremonial occasions reflects both the prestige attached to Roman world goods and the genuine appeal of a drink with different properties and associations. The quantities of amphora sherds found at late Iron Age elite sites suggest that imported wine was consumed in very large quantities, indeed at certain establishments, which raises interesting questions about the nature of the ceremonies and the condition of the participants at their conclusion. The smiths and craftspeople of Iron Age Britain occupied a position of considerable social prestige. Metalworking, particularly in bronze and iron and the precious metals gold and silver, was not simply skilled labor. It was understood as a form of transformation, the alchemical conversion of raw materials extracted from the earth into objects of beauty and power, that carried sacred dimensions. The smith in Celtic mythology is a figure of special status, often associated with the divine. Goibniu in Irish mythology, the divine smith whose beer confers immortality. Gofanon in Welsh mythology, the smith god who is the son of the mother goddess, Don. The special status of the smith was practically grounded in the genuine rarity of metallurgical knowledge and skill, but it was also theologically grounded in the understanding of transformation as a divine act. The tools and weapons that came from the smithy were not just functional objects. They were the products of a process that had been given sacred dignity by the tradition, and many of them were understood as having properties beyond the purely physical. A sword made by a great smith was not just a superior weapon, it was an object with its own identity, its own name, its own history, capable of binding its owner to it in relationships of loyalty and mutual obligation that the literature of the Celtic world explores with great sophistication. The swords that were thrown into rivers as votive offerings were not simply discarded. They were returned to the world from which their metal came, completing a cycle that the tradition understood as necessary and right. Women in pre-Roman British society occupied a position that, while not equal to that of men in most respects, was considerably more significant and varied than the Roman depiction of Celtic society typically acknowledges. The classical sources occasionally note with evident surprise and some discomfort the relatively greater freedom of Celtic women compared to Roman women, their participation in public life, their ability to own property, their legal standing, their role in religious ceremony. Boudica was not a unique or anomalous figure. She was extraordinary in the scale of what she accomplished, but the idea of a woman exercising political and military leadership was not foreign to the Celtic tradition in the way it was foreign to the Roman tradition. Queen Cartimandua of the Brigantes was another example, a woman who ruled a major tribal confederation in her own right, making strategic decisions of considerable consequence, commanding the loyalty of her warriors, negotiating with Rome as a sovereign equal. The Druidic tradition, moreover, appears to have included women. The term Druides, in Latin Druidissa, appears in the historical sources, and women associated with prophecy and sacred knowledge are a consistent presence in the Celtic literary tradition. The women standing on the shore at Anglesey when Suetonius Paulinus's army arrived, carrying torches and calling down curses, were not random civilians. They were practitioners, women trained in the sacred tradition. performing their function in the moment of its destruction. Their names were not recorded. Their training and their knowledge were lost with them. But they were there, and their presence in that account is important evidence that the Druidic tradition was not exclusively male. The childhood of a pre-Roman British child would have been shaped from the beginning by an intimate relationship with the natural world and with the cosmological understanding of that world that the tradition maintained. Children grew up knowing that certain trees were sacred. The oak, above all, the tree most closely associated with Druidic practice, its name cognate in Celtic languages with the word for wisdom. The ash and the hazel and the yew and the rowan, each with their own sacred associations, their own mythological connections, their own powers. They grew up knowing that certain springs were holy, that certain hills were places where the other world was close, that certain times of year were charged with a special quality of divine presence or danger. The great festivals of the Celtic calendar structured the year into 8 distinct seasons, each marked by ceremony and celebration and particular religious observance. Samhain, at the end of October, was the festival of the dead, the time when the boundary between the living world and the other world was at its thinnest, when the dead might return to visit the living, when the spirit world was closest and most accessible. This is the festival that survived the conversion to Christianity, transformed and attenuated as Halloween, the Christian liturgical feast of All Souls being placed on the 1st of November to overlay and absorb the pre-Christian festival of Samhain. The bonfires, the costumes, the sense of the uncanny that clings to the end of October, even in a fully secularized 21st century. These are the last echo of a festival that has been celebrated in Britain for at least 2,000 years, and probably much longer. Imbolc, at the beginning of February, was associated with the goddess Brigid and with the first stirrings of spring, the lactation of ewes, the lengthening of days, the return of light. Beltane, at the beginning of May, was the great fire festival, when cattle were driven between bonfires to purify them before the summer pasture season, when the transition from the dark half of the year to the light half was celebrated with fire and ceremony. Lugnasad, at the beginning of August, was the harvest festival, associated with the god Lugh and with the games and assemblies and marriages that the gathered harvest made possible. Between these 4 great fire festivals, the solstices and equinoxes marked the astronomical turning points of the year, less elaborately celebrated perhaps, but no less cosmologically significant. This calendar was not arbitrary. It was calibrated with great precision to the agricultural and ecological rhythms of the British Isles, to the patterns of weather and plant growth and animal behavior that governed the survival and prosperity of farming communities. The Druids who maintained and interpreted the calendar were not simply priests performing empty ritual. They were custodians of a practical knowledge system, a knowledge of when to plant and when to harvest, when the ground would be workable and when the animals should be moved. That was encoded in the sacred framework of the religious year. The festivals were the interface between the cosmological and the practical, the places where theology and agriculture met and confirmed each other. That interface was maintained for centuries after the Romans came, in modified and attenuated form, by communities that had adapted to the new conditions while preserving what they could of the old framework. When Christianity arrived in Britain in the late Roman period, the first British Christian martyr, Alban, was executed around 304 CE during the Diocletianic persecutions, and there were evidently established Christian communities in Britain by that point. The process of negotiation between the new faith and the old tradition began that would eventually produce the distinctive character of Celtic Christianity. The Celtic Church, which flourished in the post-Roman period in Ireland and the western margins of Britain, was a Christianity that had absorbed many features of the pre-Christian tradition: the reverence for sacred landscape, The emphasis on individual spiritual experience in nature, the concept of the soul, friend, or anamchara as a guide through spiritual development, the integration of monastic life with the rhythms of the natural world, in ways that made it genuinely different from the Roman Christianity of the continent. This is not to say that Celtic Christianity was simply pre-Christian religion in disguise. It was a genuine, serious, theologically sophisticated form of Christianity, producing scholars and missionaries and mystics of the first rank. But it was a Christianity that had grown in the soil of the Celtic tradition, and that soil had given it a particular flavor and emphasis, a particular way of understanding the relationship between the divine and the natural world, the individual and the community, the living and the dead, that distinguished it from the more institutional, legally structured Christianity of Rome. When the Synod of Whitby in 664 CE effectively chose Roman rather than Celtic practice as the standard for the English Church, it was in a small but real way repeating the choice that the Roman conquest had imposed 6 centuries earlier, the imposition of a centralized institutional framework on a tradition that had organized itself around different principles. The linguistic archaeology of Britain adds constant detail to this picture of a world that was buried but not entirely destroyed. The place names are inexhaustible in their testimony. Every time a British town name includes the element Chester or Cesta or Casta, from the Latin castra, meaning fort, it is recording the fact of Roman military occupation at that location. But the elements that precede the Roman suffix are often British. Manchester, from the British Mamusium, Colchester, from the British Camulodunum, Winchester, from the British Venta Belgarum. The Roman and British layers are fused in the names, inseparable, each recording a different stratum of the history of the place. And beneath the Roman layer, the British names are often themselves translucent to an older world. Camulodunum contains the element camulo, possibly connected to the British war god Camulos, giving us a glimpse of the sacred geography of the pre-Roman Catuvellauni, the divine presence that was woven into the name of their capital. The river names go even further back. The name Avon is simply the British Celtic word for river, Aphon in modern Welsh, which means that in every river Avon in Britain is simply called River, the British name having been kept by subsequent inhabitants who no longer spoke the language, but recognized the name as the name of that water and passed it on. There are several rivers called Avon in England and Scotland, each one a small monument to the persistence of the British language through centuries of linguistic change, each one saying the same word that a British farmer said standing on the same bank 2,000 years ago. The word has outlasted the empire that tried to erase the culture that spoke it. The word is older than the roads, older than the towns, older than everything the Romans built on this island. It is still here. The genetics confirm what the linguistics suggest. The most comprehensive ancient DNA studies of the British population, published in the early decades of the 21st century, have traced the ancestry of modern British people through successive waves of migration and admixture, with a precision that was simply impossible for earlier generations of researchers. The picture that emerges is of a population whose genetic foundations were laid in the Neolithic and Bronze Age, substantially transformed by the Belgica migration of around 4,000 years ago, relatively stable through the Iron Age and Roman period, and then significantly altered in the east and south by Anglo-Saxon settlement in the post-Roman period. But the Celtic-British genetic component, the ancestry that traces back to the Iron Age and earlier inhabitants of these islands, remains substantial throughout Britain, dominant in Wales and Scotland, and significant even in the most Anglo-Saxon-influenced parts of England. The people walking the streets of modern British cities carry in their DNA the legacy of the people who built Stonehenge, who hammered the Battersea Shield, who stood their ground at Maiden Castle and lost. They carry it without knowing it, for the most part. The genetic inheritance is invisible, expressed only in the patterns of biochemical variation that can be read by modern analytical techniques. But it is there, in millions of people, connecting them to a world they have largely forgotten existed. What would it mean to truly remember that world? Not to romanticize it, not to project our own desires onto the past, not to construct a usable mythology out of selected fragments, but to genuinely remember it, to hold in mind the full reality of a civilization that was, to acknowledge the loss of what it knew and what it was, to resist the impulse to accept the Roman account of what Britain was before Rome arrived as the final word on the matter. It would mean, at minimum, taking seriously the evidence of the archaeology on its own terms, rather than as a footnote to the classical literary sources. It would mean treating the people who built the hill forts and the roundhouses and the sacred groves as people, as fully developed human beings with complex inner lives and sophisticated cultural frameworks, rather than as a background against which the drama of Roman civilization unfolds. It would mean recognizing that the history of this island did not begin with Julius Caesar and did not begin with the Claudian invasion, but began in the deep past of a human presence that has been continuous on these islands for at least 8,000 years and possibly much longer. It would mean, perhaps most importantly, sitting with the discomfort of irrecoverable loss. There are things about pre-Roman Britain that we will never know, because the knowledge was held in human minds that are dust, in voices that have been silent for 2,000 years. The full theological system of the Druids, the complete mythological corpus of the British Celtic tradition, the legal philosophy that governed the resolution of disputes between tribes, the astronomical knowledge that the great stone circles encoded. All of this is gone, and no amount of archaeological excavation or genetic analysis or linguistic reconstruction will fully recover it. That loss is real. It is a permanent impoverishment of the human record, a hole in the story of this island that cannot be filled. Sitting with that discomfort without resolving it too quickly, without substituting romance for the genuine unknown, without collapsing the complexity of the loss into a simple narrative of noble savages destroyed by evil empire, is perhaps the most honest thing we can do. We can acknowledge what was there as fully and accurately as the evidence allows. We can acknowledge what was done to it and refuse to sanitize that destruction into a neutral process of historical inevitability. We can listen to the fragments that survive in the Welsh language, in the place names, in the folk traditions, in the mythological materials, in the objects in museum cases, in the landscape itself, with more attention than we typically give them. And we can resist, gently but persistently, the tendency to treat Roman Britain as the beginning of the story. It was not the beginning. It was an interruption, a violent, transformative, in some ways catastrophic interruption. In a story that had been unfolding for thousands of years before the legions arrived and that continued, in transformed form, for thousands of years after they left. The beginning of the British story is in the deep past, in the hands of Neolithic farmers, shaping long barrows from chalk and timber, in the minds of astronomers tracking the sun across Salisbury Plain, in the fingers of Bronze Age smiths working alloy into spiral forms, in the voices of Iron Age bards composing praise for kings whose names we will never know. That is where the story begins, and its deepest roots are in a world that Rome tried very hard to ensure we would forget. We haven't forgotten entirely, not yet. But there is a particular kind of forgetting that is more dangerous than simple ignorance, and it is the forgetting that masquerades as knowledge. For centuries, the story told about pre-Roman Britain was not a story of unknown mystery, but a story of confidently described barbarism. The Celts were primitive, the Romans were civilized, and the conquest was the beginning of something better. That confident story, repeated in schools and textbooks and popular histories, was more destructive in some ways than simple silence would have been, because it actively displaced the more complicated and more honest account with one that served the interest of those who told it. When the Romans described the Celts, they were describing themselves by contrast, defining civilization by identifying what it was not. And when the inheritors of the Roman tradition repeated those descriptions, they were doing the same thing, defining their own civilization as the legitimate heir of Rome by accepting Rome's characterization of what came before. This is the mechanism by which the erasure was completed and maintained long after the Roman legions were gone. The destruction of the Druids and their tradition was a physical act, carried out with iron and fire and the organized violence of a professional army. But the erasure of the memory of pre-Roman Britain as a sophisticated and valuable civilization was an intellectual act, carried out through centuries of storytelling and scholarship and education. Through the acceptance of the Roman account as the authoritative account, through the assumption that what the Romans built on this island was an improvement rather than a replacement. That intellectual erasure was more lasting in some ways than the physical destruction, because it shaped the questions that scholars asked and the significance they assigned to what they found. The shift that has occurred in the understanding of Iron Age Britain over the past 50 years is therefore not just an academic revision. It is a recovery of something that was stolen, not by Rome, which is long gone, but by the centuries-long tradition of accepting Rome's self-serving account of what it found here. The archaeologists and geneticists and linguists who have rebuilt the picture of pre-Roman Britain from evidence on the ground have done something genuinely important. They have restored, at least in outline, the dignity of a world that was designed to be forgotten. The complexity of the hill forts, the sophistication of the art, the scale of the trade networks, the depth of the religious tradition, the antiquity of the astronomical knowledge. All of this was always there, in the ground, waiting to be found by people who came to it with different assumptions than those the Roman account imposed. That recovery is still ongoing. Every new excavation, every new application of isotopic or genetic or remote sensing technology to the pre-Roman landscape adds detail and depth to the picture. The LiDAR surveys that have in recent decades revealed the full complexity of the pre-Roman landscape. The field systems, the trackways, the settlement patterns that were invisible to earlier generations of archaeologists have shown a countryside organized and inhabited with an intensity and care that the traditional account never imagined. The genetic studies have given us the demographic reality of who was here and where they came from and where their descendants went. The linguistic studies have traced the threads of Celtic language and place name survival with increasing precision. The picture is still incomplete. It will always be incomplete. But it is incomparably richer than the picture available even a generation ago. What it shows us, above all, is that Britain before Rome was a real place, inhabited by real people, with real traditions and real knowledge and real ways of understanding themselves and their world. Not a prelapsarian paradise, not a golden age of innocent harmony with nature. A real human world, with all the complexity and contradiction and beauty and violence that the real human world always contains. A world that had been developing for thousands of years on this island, and that had reached, in the centuries immediately before the conquest, a level of complexity and sophistication that deserves to be recognized and respected on its own terms. The Romans came. They brought things of value, their roads, their law, their engineering, their literature, their wine and their olive oil and their concept of the written word as the vessel of accumulated knowledge. And they took things of enormous value, the freedom of the people they conquered, the continuity of a tradition, the voices of the Druids, the living knowledge of a sacred world that had been built and maintained with great care and intelligence over a very long time. The taking was as real as the giving, and the taking was deliberate, systematic, and informed by the understanding that what was taken, if left in place, would resist everything that was being imposed. That is the story that the Romans preferred not to tell. It is the story that is still being recovered, piece by piece, from the ground of this island and the languages of its people and the patterns of its landscape. It is a story worth telling, it is a story worth hearing, and it begins as all the deepest stories of this island begin. Long before the first Roman soldier ever set foot on British soil, in a world that was already ancient when Rome was young. The hills of Wales, the moors of Cornwall, the stone circles of Scotland, the chalk downlands of Wiltshire. These are not simply landscapes. They are texts, written in a language that takes patience and attention to read. Every ridge and valley, every spring and standing stone, every hollow way worn down by feet that walked it for generations before the Romans came and for generations after they left, carries something of the story. The story does not announce itself. It does not come with labels or explanations. It is simply there, in the land, waiting for the attention that it deserves and has too rarely received. The people who built this world, who walked these hills and prayed at these springs and composed their songs beside these rivers, were not a prelude to something more important. They were not the rough draft of a civilization that the Romans would improve into final form. They were complete in themselves, a people fully arrived in their own tradition, possessed of knowledge and art and philosophy and spiritual understanding that was the product of genuine human genius applied over many generations to the specific conditions of this specific island. Their world is gone, but it was real. It happened. And in the fragments that survive, in the language and the landscape and the long, deep, unbroken genetic thread, it is still, in some sense, here. That is what was here before the Romans, and that is what was lost when the Romans came. In the bogs of Cheshire and the marshes of East Anglia, the bodies of people who lived before the Romans still sleep in the preserved dark, their last meals in their stomachs, their final gestures frozen in the peat. In the ground beneath the fields of Wiltshire and Dorset and Oxfordshire, the foundations of roundhouses and the post holes of great timber halls still wait for the archaeologist's trowel. In museums across Britain, the objects, the talks and the mirrors and the shields and the cauldrons still catch the light as they caught it 2,000 years ago, still asking to be seen clearly, still insisting, in their mute but eloquent way, that they were made by people who mattered. Before the Romans, an entire civilization ruled these islands. It was not a barbarian fringe at the edge of the known world. It was a living, breathing, thinking, creating, believing, loving, grieving, celebrating, arguing, praying civilization, rooted in a landscape it knew intimately, connected to a past it honored carefully, oriented toward a future it hoped for earnestly. Its gods were real to it, its dead were present to it, its knowledge was deep, and its art was beautiful, and its people were fully, completely, irreducibly human. And then it was erased. Not entirely, not completely, not without remnant, but erased in the ways that matter most. In the loss of its own voice, its own account of itself, its own record of what it believed and what it knew and what it hoped for. What survives is fragments, echoes, shadows, enough to know that something immense and real was there, not enough to hear it speak. That is the story of pre-Roman Britain, and it is a story that is still being told, slowly, painstakingly, by archaeologists digging in the earth and geneticists reading ancient DNA and linguists tracing the roots of words and historians asking uncomfortable questions about whose past gets to count as history. It is a story that may never be fully told because too much of it was too deliberately destroyed. But the telling matters, the attempt matters, because in the attempt we acknowledge that it existed, that it counted, that its people were real, that their world had value, and that what was done to them and to their tradition was not simply the inevitable forward march of civilization, but a choice made by particular people in particular circumstances, with particular consequences that are still felt in the silence beneath the stories we have always been told. Britain did not begin with Rome. It began long, long before Rome, and what it was before Rome, in all its complexity and beauty and depth, deserves to be remembered as fully and as honestly as the fragments allow. The threads are still there, if you know how to follow them, in the names of rivers, in the grammar of a living language, in the geometry of a bronze mirror, in the position of a stone cut with extraordinary precision to catch the light at midsummer dawn, in the peat-dark face of a man who died 2,000 years ago in a ceremony we cannot fully understand, in a world that no longer exists, but that was once as real and as present and as alive as the world we inhabit now. Follow the threads far enough and you find them. The Romans called it the edge of the world. The people who lived here knew it was the center of their world. That is what was taken from them. And that is why it matters that we remember it now, in the long echo of the silence that followed.